I'm Ann Tainer, and I'm coming to you from the Pop-Up Museum on the Key, which was made possible by Jane Morris and the Key Biscayne Foundation. We were unable to open in the spring like we hoped, so now we're bringing it to you by video. The pop-up museums were very popular around the country because it's an ability to exhibit in small spaces and the idea of changing it on a regular basis. History Society was started around 2007 by Bob Brissell, Dr. Maggs, Ed Meyer, with the idea of preserving our island heritage. So we can continue with the endeavor to bring history to the island. It's a very long and interesting history. It needs to be taught, it needs to be learned, not now, but for future generations. We are very fortunate to have this video being done by Dr. George. Dr. George is a native Miamian, has taught at Florida State, Florida Atlantic, Florida A&M, University of Miami, and Miami-Dade. He's a teacher, a historian, a lecturer. He has published over 15 books and written over 200 articles. He has done tours all over Miami as well as lectures. In 1997, he served on the Miami-Dade Preservation Board. He is now an associate of the History Museum of Miami. If you have not heard him before, you will enjoy this. If you have, sit back and listen. We're very truly honored and lucky to have him here with us, Dr. George. He's looking at an aerial map of Key Biscayne in 1926, and he's going to give us some history here.
Listen, delighted to. The survey was done by our maid for U.M. Matheson, who ran the family's farm plantation on Key Biscayne. The Matheson family really sort of usher in, I think, the 20th century when you're looking at the history of Key Biscayne. What happened was William J. Matheson, who was the patriarch of the family, was a very wealthy industrialist and inventor, business person from Long Island. He had a son, Hugh Matheson, who was one of his prized children, who was attending what today would be Ransom Everglades School in Coconut Grove. And his son invited him down. He said, listen, I rented a little boat for you. It was a boarding school. Half the school was up in the Adirondacks during the good weather months in New York. And come on down. And so he came down in the early 1900s, Hugh Matheson did, and fell in love with the area and decided to move down here with his family. He had 3 or 4 children, his wife. And they bought a lot of land in Coconut Grove, but by about 1908, he bought what would be 1,700 out of the almost 2,400 acres that comprise the island of Key Biscayne. And so what you have here is a wonderful aerial survey, and it kind of lays out what they had. They got into a plant laboratory business. They grew everything from limes to obviously coconut palms, which became their great crop. In fact, by the late 1920s, they had over 50,000 coconut palms that were grown in different parts of their holdings, and that became their main crop. And it wasn't so much the coconut palms. You can see the chunk of what's going on here in this area here. It wasn't so much the coconut palms for food. They were more for ornamental trees. They were more for other things. Sometimes they were used, they would take the entire coconut and they would paint it and sell it to tourists. Tourists love, in those days, tourism was much simpler than it is today. They'd love to come to the Miami area and come back with souvenirs, whether it be a stuffed alligator or a coconut. And that's, among other things, what the Mathesons sold with it. At one point, they even used them for some gas masks, some of the tusks of the coconut. So you've got this great aerial shot of the island. Now, the island didn't begin, its history didn't begin with the Mathesons. And it didn't begin in the 19th century either, which we're going to be talking about a little later on. Instead, it began with what Juan Ponce de Leon, who likely touched down on this island way back in the spring, summer of 1513, what he called Tequestas, which became the first place name that we're aware of for the Miami area, as well as the first name that we're aware of for the native Miamians, the Tequesta Indians. And we know Juan Ponce de Leon didn't know it, and we didn't know it until after Hurricane Andrew in 1992, that there was a large Tequesta settlement on the northern edges of Key Biscayne. We know it because there was great and grave damage to the island in the, as a result of Hurricane Andrew. And the archaeologists led by Robert Carr, who was the county archaeologist, came in soon after Hurricane Andrew struck in August of 1992. And they commenced 3 excavations on the northern tip of the island. And they determined, based on what they found, that there had been a substantial Tequesta Indian population going back at least a couple thousand years, which really completely changed our look at Tequestas. We knew that there might have been some on the island. We believed, and it's probably still correct, that the largest concentration was on the north bank of the Monroe at the mouth. But lo and behold, now we find this large concentration, which has always made me think that, okay, if you had, who knows how many, hundreds, maybe more of Tequesta Indians, that meant there had to be a source of fresh water. So that leads us to a couple things. Were there springs here? Were they building cisterns, or were they using some element of Mother Nature as a water collector, like an early version of a cistern, in order to sustain that population? So we've got Key Biscayne history that goes back thousands of years. In fact, the area that separates Virginia Key from Key Biscayne, we know that as Bear's Cut, and as the stories go, and there have been observations on the part of people in the area going back to the 1700s, there were wild bears that sometimes frolicked on the edge of land in that channel with that swift flowing body of water. And it's interesting to note that Key Biscayne, of course, is a much larger and more substantial island than is Virginia Key, but they both played such an interesting role in the history of the area. And that continues to play out today. Virginia Key, for example, had the first segregated black beach. And now we're observing every August 1st as an anniversary of that. So there's a lot of things going on, but we've got this great map. You can see part of the plantation. Initially, as I mentioned before, they grew different crops. The only crops that seemed to hold up against that salt spray blasting them from the water were coconut palm trees. And so they became a coconut palm preserve with still over 40,000 as late as the 1940s. And everything's going to change because the causeway is going to open. We'll talk about that later on, the Rickenbacker Causeway. And it's going to lead to the residential and commercial development of Key Biscayne. And so they're going to sell off that large tract of land. They're going to split it up into many parts. Developers are going to come in at the end of the 1940s. They're going to begin to build a tremendous residential base for the island, primarily on the south side of the island, that is on the bay side of the island as opposed to the ocean side, so much of which would be taken up by Crandon Park. But we'll come back and talk more about that deal, that quid pro quo that brought us this 800-acre plus waterfront park that extended really all the way from the Atlantic Ocean to Biscayne Bay. And we'll talk about how the Matheson played a role in that, Charlie Crandon played a role in that, Ed Ball played a role in that, and it just goes on and on. Eddie Rickenbacker, of course, we had the causeway named for him that would go right through that land. So I thought we would walk over here. We're looking now at the 1920s. We've already sort of set the plan, that is, that we had people on the island going back thousands of years, but we begin to see a sort of a quickening change on the island by the 1920s. A photo of the Davis house built in the late 19th century. The name Davis was magic on Key Biscayne in the 19th century. Mary Ann Davis, the matriarch of a family out of New York and Galveston, bought a large swath of land on the southern part of Key Biscayne. Actually bought it from the estate of a Spaniard, Pedro Fornells, who had received it from the Spanish, a grant, in the late 18th century. He passed away, and so his estate sold it off. She bought it at the outset of the 1820s. Mary Ann Davis, an astute businesswoman, would also sell a 3-acre site to the U.S. Life-Saving Service to build the Cape Florida Lighthouse. And we'll talk a little more about that as we move through this. But the family came back long after that initial visit and settlement. They came back in the late 19th century and took back, financially and otherwise, took back some of the land they'd had earlier. And as part of that, they built, you can see here, it's built in the last decade of the 19th century, they built the Cape House. And one of the keys to its construction was a man named Ralph Monroe, who was a very gifted guy, kind of a Renaissance man, lived in Coconut Grove, was a shallow draft sailboat designer, and he was hired by Mr. Davis. Again, this would be a descendant of Mary Ann Davis and her family, to build this, and he built it about 10 feet up off the water line. He built it back from the water. There's been a lot of shoreline erosion over time, obviously, but look at this here, isn't this something? How about the coconut palms surrounding it? Going back to the Matheson days, but also going back even earlier to a time when, in the 1880s, the Osborne and Field families out of the north, New Jersey and Ohio, had started a coconut palm plantation in Key Biscayne. They picked up a tremendous amount of land, shoreline land from the federal government. They took them all the way north of Miami Beach, up into the area of today's Broward County and beyond. And so these are some of the remnants then of this. This looks out over the Cape Florida Channel, looks out over Biscayne Bay, but it's just it's a very interesting place. It eventually was taken out by a hurricane in the early part of the 20th century. But this was one of the great emblems of Key Biscayne when it was still pretty raw and undeveloped. One of the few structures on the island at that time. This precedes, of course, the Matheson family. And then we got the Artesian Well. And you can see the well was put in use in 1917, so on and so forth. Why? What was happening then? Well, the Mathesons had created, or were beginning to create, their plantation, and they needed water. Now, the Mathesons owned the property, and we looked at the map before. They owned the property that covered much of the island with the exception of that southern part, 500 acres plus. That was at one time the province of the Davis family, and later on was purchased by James Daring, of all people, who built Biscaya. And this was the land, and the Artesian Well would be north of there on the island. And then you've got this is really interesting, this 1929 aerial view of the plantation. You're looking at it here. The dividing canal, we call it the Pines Canal. Listen, it moved in a straight line at that time. Look at this here, from bay to ocean. And over time, the ocean part was filled in. And if you look around today, Key Biscayne, you can come into the canal, but then it kind of leads you in this area here. They've dug some additional canals as they developed this into a very high-end area. But as you can see here, it split the canal. So you catch the Pines Canal, when you're coming in, say on a boat, you're moving in the direction of downtown Miami, moving past the Cape Florida Lighthouse, the canal pops up. And it is a dividing line. It divides that southern area that was not owned by the Mathesons, later owned by James Daring, later owned by the Alamán Garcia family, and eventually became part of Bill Bagg's Cape Florida State Park, which is an absolute jewel, as we all know. You should note also that the Pines Canal was one of the settings, one of the many settings, for the filming at the end of the 1960s. It appeared in 1970 of a movie depicting the Japanese attack on Pearl Harbor, Tora, Tora, Tora. You should also note that in 1944, a portion of the island was used, and the props are still around as late as the 70s, for the filming of John Wayne's movie, They Were Expendable, a World War II movie that was made during the waning period of that war. But again, you can see what the Mathesons have done here. They're ready to do more development in this immediate area here. By development, I mean farmland. And again, they had a large cadre of workers. Many were white and black Bahamians, and they were confined to the island. There was no bridge until 1947, but they had a community. They had a school, they had a playhouse, they had a house of worship, they had pretty simple wood frame homes they lived in. I guess their treat was that occasionally, it could be as much as maybe once every 10, 15 days, they would boat over from the island to, in the case of many Bahamians, Coconut Grove that was filled with black and white Bahamians. So you're looking now at the plantation as the Mathesons at this point had owned the property for 20 plus years. Looking down Royal Palm Drive from Crandon Boulevard, I'm just looking, it's very close to where we are today. I want to point out a couple things about this. Royal Palms are indigenous to, among other places, the Everglades. So if you traipsed into the Everglades, and there's only 2 million out of 4 million acres left of the Everglades, thank God for Everglades National Park, and you might come across a hammock, sort of an island with a swamp around it, you would find in many cases royal palm trees, very commonplace. They're also native to the Caribbean and the West Indies. And see, the Mathesons took great care. They had to get around. There had to be roads, not so much for mechanized vehicles, except farm-related vehicles, but there had to be places for their people to get around. And so they carved these through the wilderness, but they very much left the wilderness as best they could up around it. Looking southwest of Smuggler's Cove Road, the road was on the southeastern end of Mashta Island. Mashta Island is a jewel, and you get a good look at it here. It looks out over Biscayne Bay, straight south. It looks out on this area over here to your right. It's an area that in many ways Mother Nature has bestowed it to look like almost like a fish hook, although there's been a lot of modification over time. Mashta Island is where the Mathesons would build their great island house, and that was the initial name of the island house. We know it today as the Mashta House, and we'll see that a little later on in our tour through this exhibit. The Mashta House would be a great guest house. A party house, although the Mathesons were not really party people, They put up the Vanderbilts there, the Carnegies there, the Mellons there, and others. It became a great, great place. Mashta is said to be, and this is Mashta Island as we call it, said to be an Egyptian term for a quiescent, peaceful place. One time William J. Matheson and his daughter were apparently on a boat going along a part of the Nile River when that whole issue came up of Mashta. And then I thought we would look at the photograph here on top, building the Rickenbacker Causeway, Bear Cut Bridge nearing completion. That would be the third bridge today. Crandon Marina, not yet developed, circa 1947. Let's talk about this because it really merits a lot of explanation. And I'm just looking now at mainland Miami here in the distance. The first bridge of the Rickenbacker Causeway up here close to the mainland. The second bridge, which was a drawbridge, would be as you're moving toward the center of the bay. And then, of course, you've got the new roadbed coming through and the bridge under construction here in 1947. So what happened here? Well, somewhere along the way, William J. Matheson really foresaw donating part of Key Biscayne to the public for public use. He died in 1930. His son, Hugh Matheson, who ran the plantation, also had that mindset. And so in the late 1930s, an agreement was made between the county, and their representative was County Commissioner Charlie Crandon, a very colorful guy who incidentally wrote an autobiography called Country Bumpkin. He lived over on Red Road between Coral Way and Bird Road, grandiose house. And an arrangement was made. The county said, we'd be more than happy to talk with you all about picking up some land in Key Biscayne. And of course, it had to be a quid pro quo. The Mathesons, even though they're very, very great benefactors, they wanted something back for it, and what they would get back would be a causeway, which of course would elevate in value significantly the land they had here in the event they wanted to sell it off, and they were coming to a time, I think, when that was under consideration. So you're going to build a causeway, but again, where's the money going to come from? Well, the causeway eventually cost a little more than $5 million, and so the county decided to float bonds on it. And the initial funding was well over $3 million. And so who are we going to get to buy this? Well, they decided to visit with Ed Ball, who was a very crusty overseer of the DuPont family's great interests in Florida. And this DuPont family had St. Joe's paper mill, tens of thousands of acres of piney forest in North Florida, the DuPont, the Florida National Bank, which was headquarters both in Miami and Jacksonville. They had the DuPont building. They had other great buildings in centers of downtown. They were just everywhere. And so Ed Ball decided, okay, I'll hear you guys out and we'll decide if, I want to buy these bonds to build a causeway that connects mainland Miami with Key Biscayne running through the 1,300-acre Virginia Key. And so Ball came over. They invited him over to the plantation. Of course, he had a boat over then. And the Mathesons asked some of their workers to shimmy up a coconut palm tree. And anybody who grew up in Miami of yesteryear, such as I did, had some ability to shimmy up a tree. I didn't get very far, but also had an ability to break open coconuts, take an ice pick, and just pop the eye of the coconut, pour that coconut juice into a glass and drink it. Well, the Mathesons went one better. The workers did all that, and then they mixed it with rum. Ed Ball had one drink. He said, this is really great. He said, I want a second drink. And by the time he was into a second drink, he said, I'll buy all the bonds. And so the bridge then was paid for by the sale of bonds by the county to the DuPont family interest, led by Ed Ball. Construction began in 1939. We should note that the original site was going to be Southeast 15th Road. The wealthy people living on the bay on Southeast 15th Road, and that was part of what we called a Millionaire's Row, said, we don't want that thing coming through here. So they were able to push it over to an undeveloped area, which would be 26th Road. And so they started building the causeway then from 26th Road, which was very woodsy at that time. And they got the first bridge done before we entered World War II, which would be at the end of 1941. They were actually beginning to build the second bridge as we entered the war. And there was even some construction going on as late as the early 1940s, which was exceptional because there wasn't building of that nature going on during the war. We needed all those resources for the war effort. And then it stopped. The war was over in August of 1945. Construction commenced again. They finished the second bridge, and they would build and complete this by 1947, the third bridge that would link up Key Biscayne and Virginia Key with mainland Miami. Now, you got the bridge done, and the bridge opens up in the fall of 1947, And it really ushers in a whole new era in the history of Key Biscayne. What's also interesting to note is that initially the tolls were, for the bridge, were something like 40 to 50 cents. And the Matheson family told the county, because not enough people were coming over. Crandon Park opened up in January of 1948. The zoo opened up within a year of that. But not enough people were coming. Matheson, listen, why don't you lower the tolls and you'll have more people coming? So they lowered it to 10 cents. And there was some kind of an assurance made, I don't think it was in writing, some kind of assurance by the county that once the bonds were paid off, we'd remove the tolls. It hasn't happened. So you've got the bridge operating. So the quid pro quo was that Matheson would turn over 810 acres of waterfront land from ocean to bay in exchange for building that causeway. And then what the Mathesons said was, okay, we've done our good deed, and they did, great people. Now we're going to begin to close down the coconut plantation and sell off this property. William J. Matheson in his will had already divided it up among 6 heirs with almost equal pieces for each of the heirs. And so they began to do that. The park opened, as I mentioned before, in January of 1948. And it's interesting to note that the landscape architect was a man named William Lyman Phillips, who in many ways was like our version of Frederick Law Olmsted from the late 19th, early 20th century, or I should say from the mid-19th to the early 20th century. And he did a great job. And what he did with the park was, and it's so interesting, Crandon Park, named for Charlie Crannon, of course, who brokered the deal. What he did was he left the northern part, the part near Bear Cut on back, he left it raw. And out of that becomes nature trails. Out of that comes the Margie Selman Douglas Nature Center. Out of that, you left alone a nearly 2,000-year-old reef that you can see as the tide moves out. You can see that reef right on the Atlantic Ocean side of that part of Key Biscayne. So he has that raw, but then Phillips, under directions, of course, from the county, because it was a county park, then developed sort of like a South Seas theme for the rest of the park, about a half plus. He had a big ball field. Eventually cabanas went up in the early 1950s. Of course, the zoo opened in '49. You had the train ride through there. Just all sorts of good things happened in the park. And he planted these Malay Palms. And these Malay Palms turned out to be a jewel because they've been able to stand up better against hurricanes than most other coconut varieties of coconut palm trees. And so you've got a jewel of a park. And, you know, just speaking as somebody who grew up in Miami, I remember what that park meant to all of us. You know, we had fewer options to go to places, didn't have any money, things of that nature. And boy, that Crandon Park was fabulous. We'd go out there as a family. My mother would cook hamburgers, and it was like heaven being out there. I also remember when I started having a lot of children, my wife and I, and we would go to the park, and then suddenly with Hurricane Andrew, there was so much damage done, although a lot of those Malay coconut palms remained standing, so much damage done, it was closed for 3 years. So when we came back there in 1995 with, at that point, just 2 children, there'd be more, with 2 children, I just said to myself, this is just so nostalgic coming back here all these decades after I first visited the park. So really one of the great jewels, I think, among the state of Florida's waterfront parks is Crandon Park. And you should note that Crandon Park had the busiest beach of any waterfront park in Florida on the eve of Hurricane Andrew. And there's a lot more to say. There's a tennis facility, there's the marina, things of that nature. The Mathesons, as we know, have been very diligent about upholding that agreement of the late 30s, beginning the 1940s for the park. And that's one reason why the tennis center, or at least the Butch Hole Stadium's no longer there, or at least operating as a tennis facility for these international tennis tournaments. And then I'm looking down below all of that to a road running east to west from the barn. The barn was one of the great iconic buildings on the Key. And when it went down, it was really a sad loss as far as a lot of historic preservationists were concerned, a sad loss for the historical patrimony of Key Biscayne. And so what you're looking at is simple little buildings in the area. The homes are very, very understated and very humble that the workers lived in, but they were treated very nicely, both white and black workers, and I think it was quite a place to be. It really was. A lot of them, this became their true blue home. Let's take a look over here, a view walking toward the Lighthouse from the west on the beach, 1948. This is a great shot here. The Cape Florida Lighthouse, built in 1825, would operate as a lighthouse until 1878, and then it was replaced by the Flowery Rock Lighthouse in that year, Ferry Rock could be 5 miles off the shoreline of Key Biscayne, right out on the on what we call the Great Florida Reef. And the lighthouse was built in order to help mariners and their boats stay away from the reef. Oftentimes prior to that, and even during that time, they ran aground and their boats became disabled. They took on water. That became one of the big businesses, in fact, in the area. So let's look at the Cape Florida Lighthouse. It was made of red brick, but it was painted white. Why? Because each of the lighthouses, and again, it opened in 1825. At that point, Florida had been American possession for 4 years. Each of the lighthouses looked different so that a mariner knew where he was going, where he was at any given time upon seeing a particular lighthouse. The initial lighthouse was only about 60 feet in height. It wasn't working well. It throws out a flicker every 6.5 seconds. And so in the mid-1850s, they elongated the lighthouse. In fact, it was a very noted Civil War, 10 years later, a very noted Civil War general who would be in charge of the construction, and they pushed it up by 30 feet, and they put in this beautiful Fresno lamp. And then when the Civil War came, unfortunately, rebel guerrillas, within the first year or so of the war, put the lamp out, so it wasn't really functioning as a lighthouse. It came back in as a lighthouse when the lamp was reconstructed or replaced in 1866, and again, eventually went out of use in 1878. Now, it stood in the center of a 3-acre site that the Davis family had sold for $400, which was more than what they paid for the entire 80 acres they bought in the southern part. It stood within that 3-acre site, but there's been so much shoreline erosion over the years and decades that it was in danger of slipping into the bay in the late 19th century. Davis family, once again, hired Ralph Monroe. He built a bulkhead here. He did some shoreline enhancement, an early version of it anyway, and they were able to keep the lighthouse from falling into the water itself. The lighthouse complex included the keeper's house and a reconstructed, or I should say another version of it, a replica was created in 1966. There's an outhouse, there's like a big cooking outdoor area, there's a cistern. They all comprise part of that. We've had some very interesting lighthouse keepers going back to 1825 with a man named John Dubose. And their whole connection with the outside world was when they had a day off, because there was usually an assistant keeper, they would sail over to the mouth of the Miami River, today's downtown Miami, the Brickell Avenue neighborhood, or they might sail as far south as the Charles Daring Estate, way down off of Old Cutler Road and about 160 plus Street. So you've got the Cape Florida Lighthouse. There have been many campaigns to rebuild it. The best job was done under a multi-million-dollar reconstruction in the 1980s, just in time for the city of Miami to celebrate its 100th birthday, which took place on July 28th, 1996. The night before they rededicated it, the light went on again, throwing off that flicker every 6.5 seconds. It was a spectacular gathering of people, including Senator Bob Graham for the ceremony. And then we have down here, looking southeast toward the Atlantic Ocean, September 1950, Mackle brothers have cut roads for their first houses from Enid to West Mashta. And you can begin to see the way everything's being laid out. Now, where there were trees, everything's been leveled because now they're going to be building homes that were very, very affordable. And some of the homes were homes geared toward vets who would qualify without having to pay a down payment or whatever, going back to the GI Bill of 1944. So if we look at this, the Alamon family has seawalled and filled the southern portion in preparation for development. Mashta Island and Mashta House are unaltered. So you're really looking at a really interesting area here. You've leveled everything here. There's going to be a lot of new development in this area. Mackle brothers are part of it. The Alleman family, who had taken possession of this land in 1944, over 400 acres, that would be on the southern tip, the upper right-hand part of this photograph. This is incidentally No Name Harbor here. And I've seen a map going back even earlier than this, where this is on the map itself. So you're looking out at the Atlantic Ocean. Here's Biscayne Bay on our right here. So it's a wonderful map. And of course, this would be Mashta Point up here as you're moving along that Cape Florida Channel. So the Mackles are going to build. The Alamans are going to build. And what the Alamans did was they leveled a subtropical hammock here in preparation for building. They never built, and that land ultimately was purchased in the 1960s by the state of Florida, and it became Bill Bagg's Cape Florida State Park, which opened up on January 1, 1967 as that park. It was known initially as Cape Florida. Bill Baggs died 2 years later, and so his name was also affixed to the park. So you can see the holdings of the Mathesons here, the great coconut plantation as you're moving toward the center of the island, and they'll go all the way up to the northern tip of the island. And then in the southern part, the Alleman family had their possessions. They were going to build a series of townhouses here, among other things. It never happened. Fortunately for a lot of kids, including mine that have come over here, use that delightful beach again and again and again. We got an aerial here, 1951, looking east. The Heather Canal runs up the Woodcrest Road. Mackle Brothers are starting on the second section of the development from Enid Drive to Heather Drive. Talking about a packing house. The locals called it the Coconut Shucking House. They had a huge packing house, the Mathesons did. Remember now, there's over 40,000 coconut palms on their plantation as late as the 1940s. And the foreground's a Hacienda Canal. I mean, there's just so much going on in this photograph, and this place is in a state of flux at this time. It's also used for early church services of the Key Biscayne Community Church. The Gulf Station, Hurricane Harbor Lounge, the Howard Johnson Restaurant, only building just after the circle at the far left. So you're talking about an area up here, a concentration of some businesses in this area. This is at 1951. It's still almost overwhelmingly undeveloped. The beach is open, the beach is very busy. People are beginning to buy Mackle homes. Incidentally, some of the homes that went on the market in 50-51 were priced for under $10,000. And those would be, they could be even bayfront homes, which in itself is absolutely amazing. Some of those same properties were assessed in 2005 at least a few $1 million to show you how they had changed in value, that whole area. We've been talking about Mashta House. So let's talk about it over here. This is very, very interesting. It's Moorish in its design. Moorish is a reference to North African Islamic architecture going back to the period when the Muslims conquered North Africa, which would be in the 9th and 10th centuries AD. And the Mathesons would build this jewel of a place, and as I mentioned before, it really was a place where they would put up guests. And William J. Matheson was wonderfully connected. He had a lot of these great industrialists of the Gilded Age in the early 1900s who were guests at the place. You can see over here the interior of it, and this is kind of a rare photograph of the interior. Just beautifully furnished, and yet there's a certain rawness when you look at the wood. Some of this looks like it's cypress, and of course the masonry walls of the place. He could proceed, as it says here, on his private island. Somebody said this looked like Cleopatra's barge going up the Nile River. That was one description of the house itself. Very stately, and in many ways just kind of a quiescent place, except usually in the wintertime when you had a lot of folks coming down here to visit. We should also note that as the island began to develop in the 1950s, you had a growing Catholic population, and their first church services, usually on Sunday, but sometimes holidays, were in the Mashta House. And later on, they would build St. Agnes Church, which incidentally was named for one of the women members of the Matheson family. So when you get a look at the house, it's so Moorish. The Mathesons were world travelers long before most people could claim that. And so they really had that background to look at. Everywhere you go, I'm seeing this photograph of Richard Hoyt, a wonderful early Miami photographer. Everywhere you go, you can see the coconut palm trees, wherever you go in the area. So we've looked at the map already. You can never really look at it enough, but here it is here, the layout of Key Biscayne itself, from bay to ocean, looking south from Virginia Key, among other places. So I thought what we'd do now is to another part of our wonderful museum and look at some additional images that will bring us into sort of a more modern era. We're going to be looking at Crandon Park and the role that it played and the many amenities that it offered people who came to the park. It was a great day when the Rickenbacker Causeway opened, as you can see, in November 9th, 10th, and 11th of 1947. There was a gate crasher. There was somebody on a motorcycle the night before it opened who wanted to be the first person over the causeway. And so he took his motorcycle, even though there were like these barricades there, took his motorcycle, got around them, and went over apparently the entire causeway and came back, and was never apprehended for it, but it has been noted. What's interesting to note is that was a county-wide celebration because we were going to have this fabulous park, 810 acres for a county then in 1947 that had less than 500,000 people. Of course, today we have 2.72 million people. But that park was just great, and there was enough room for everybody at the time. You can see here with this cover picture here, Crandon Park and Rickenbacker Causeway, and this was published on the occasion of the opening, again in November 1947, how lush it is with coconut palm trees, because what the Mathesons did was they left up in that area parts of what had been the coconut plantation. But also under William Lyman Phillips' design, they planted in different areas these Malay coconut palms. And so what they've done here is they've cut a trail through what had been a natural forest of coconut palm trees. And then you have here, John Pennekamp was a very influential Miami Herald editor, and the Miami Herald was an incredibly influential voice in Miami at the time. And so he has penned an editorial here for his column called Behind the Front Page, and he says, wait and see, New County Park will draw international notice, and he's just raving about the park itself. We hadn't seen anything like this. We'd seen Miami in its natural raw state, but nothing like this, 810 acres of oceanfront. And so here we have then just sort of an illustration of the way it looks and what people can do within the park itself. It's a little bit fanciful, but that's fine too. And you get a sense of the island itself. Look at the Gulf Stream, how near it is, and probably about 5 or more miles off the shoreline of Key Biscayne. But it's a very important body of water too. It's a great flow. Here's Charlie Crandon, who again was the county commissioner who brokered the whole deal, thus Crandon Park. And here's Eddie Rickenbacker. And this is very interesting because the Board of County Commissioners, Dade County, named the causeway in honor of Captain Eddie Rickenbacker. Eddie Rickenbacker was not only an aerial ace in World War I, he also flew in World War II as a middle-aged man. In fact, his airplane went down with a small number of men on it, and they were at sea. They all survived the plane going down, and they were in life rafts, but they were beginning to run out of water and food supplies. And Eddie Rickenbacker, this is out in the Pacific, while in the water, was kind of like fading between consciousness and unconsciousness. He felt something on him, and it was a seagull. And he grabbed the seagull and ate a portion of it apparently, used other parts to lure fish, and somehow they survived. And so as an old man, Eddie Rickenbacker liked to spend parts of Friday evenings walking out on pier somewhere with a big bucket of shrimp and feeding the birds. Just an appreciation for the fact that he believed a bird had saved his life and eventually the lives of the men who went down in that plane with him. Eddie Rickenbacker was not only president of Eastern Airlines, he was owner of Eastern Airlines, which was the largest employer in Miami, Miami-Dade County, or Dade County as they called it then, for several decades. And this is interesting, the facts and figures on the Rickenbacker Causeway. It's nearly 4 miles in length. Almost 3 miles of that 4-mile area was fill, and then a lot of it's over the water bridge structure. And it just goes on and on to describe how it was made. Crandon Park was made possible only through the generosity and civic mindedness of the heirs of Dr. William J. Matheson, especially his son and his son's wife. That would be Hugh Matheson and his wife, Liguori Matheson. Very, very important in playing a role with this. So we've got these wonderful illustrations here that I don't think most people have seen, myself included, so I was really thrilled to come upon them. And then we've got some interesting elements here, the Ferry Rock Lighthouse. Look at the size of the lighthouse. It's multiple stories in height. And it was considered to be so sophisticated as a machine that a portion of it, essentially this portion here, before they put it all together and began operating in 1878, a portion of it was used for what was called the centenary, the Philadelphia centenary of 1876, the 100th anniversary, in other words, of the Declaration of Independence. And they had like an arts and industry building there in Philadelphia, in Fairmount Park, and they had a portion of the Ferry Rock Lighthouse there as an example of these state-of-the-art machines, and in this case, structures that were being built during this early part of the Gilded Age. So you've got a great rendering of it here. And there's so many stories about it because if you went out there to visit, you had to go by sailboat. Ralph Monroe, who was a great sailor, went out there one time. He was visiting the keeper. See, today it's automated, but you had keepers for many, many years after it opened in 1878. He was out there and he came across, well, he was visiting a postal map. And the map indicated that there was a post office in an area where he and a bunch of other people live in that today we know as Coconut Grove. And he came back to the people in Coconut Grove. They stayed around the Peacock Inn in today's Peacock Park, and he said, guys, I got news for you. We've got a name. It's called Coconut Grove. C-O-C-O-A-N-U-T. They dropped the A when they incorporated as a city in 1919, or as a town in 1919. But this is where he found what we know as Coconut Grove right over here today. And then you've got the picture right shows the skeleton remains of the 1917 Madison Coconut Plantation Cottage. Been used at different times, sleeping quarters, first church service for St. Christopher Church here, the drama club. There's a whole bunch of important events in the history of Key Biscayne that took place. Simple wood frame, that's Day County pine. It endured some pretty ferocious hurricanes. We had one in 1906 that was pretty nasty. We had the killer hurricane of 1926. And that killer hurricane, the people living on this island, in fact, and that's a hurricane that took out well over 100 people in Day County. People living on this island actually came together and they stayed in the barn. And they stayed at the second level of the barn because the water surge came right through the island itself. Many would have drowned had they been down on the first floor. So this island has been very, very vulnerable because of location and because of the waters to storms. Hurricane Betsy, for example, in 1965, Labor Day hurricane, cut loose a barge from its moorings, and as a result of it, that barge banged into the third bridge, and it just closed traffic down for many, many days. I think it was almost a couple of weeks, ultimately. You've got here the first telephone in Key Biscayne, one of the earliest models invented by Alexander Graham Bell, who incidentally was for a few years a regular visitor to Coconut Grove, where the Campong is today. And the enterprising Matheson family, and they were enterprising, believe me, in 1916, whose mainland residence was in Coconut Grove, established a Coconut Grove Public Utilities Company there with 6 subscribers. And so they're talking about then a pre-Causeway vintage telephone, hand crank, wall mount, wood and metal here. And this is, oh my God, this is really something. And I hope that every lucky person that visits this museum gets a look at this, because I've never quite seen anything like this before, but it's really interesting. So the Mathesons provided then the water service and the telephone service for Coconut Grove, but of course, since they had much of the island, they also provided the first telephone for the island. So we've got to look at the cottage over here, and it's interesting, the Mathesons provided in Coconut Grove phone service and water service to Coconut Grove until it was annexed to the city of Miami in 1925. The Mathesons, because they owned so much of the island, provided just one telephone that operated from this cottage in the image here. And the cottage had a tremendous history in itself. So you had a phone in the cottage, but there was a connector phone not on Key Biscayne, but at the Ferry Lighthouse, so that the keeper of the house and the people on this end of the phone, namely the Mathesons among others, would communicate, since there was that tie between Ferry Rock and the island of Key Biscayne itself. And we had a matching phone then, such as this, that stood or sat in the Ferry Rock Lighthouse. And you can see the bells, of course, that would tip you off that a call was coming in. It's just a really interesting setup. And what's also fascinating about it is that it's an early model that was invented by Alexander Graham Bell. Alexander Graham Bell oftentimes, I think, is overlooked for how important he was as an inventor, because we tend to embrace Thomas Edison, and that's very, very justified. But Bell was right up there too. For example, he invented not just the phone, but an early version of what was an X-ray machine. And it was even used as early as 1881 to examine the wound that the president, James Garfield, had sustained at the hands of an assassin. So Bell was very important. He comes into Miami because his son-in-law was David Fairchild, married to one of Alexander Graham Bell's daughters. So he was a winter visitor to what we know today as the Campong. And here he is with one of his phone models here that operated out of this area. So how did this happen to come about? I would stake my name on the fact that William J. Matheson was a friend and acquaintance of Alexander Graham Bell. And that's how this phone got out here, and how you made the connection with a similar phone out of the Ferry Rock Lighthouse. And you can see the lighthouse right over here. And again, you talk about high tech. This was the epitome of technology. You mentioned earlier, it was recognized as such because it was a major exhibition element in the Philadelphia Centennial Celebration. Very interesting story. And then we come to the Causeway Opening, and you talk about a benchmark year, the year 1947 has to be, because it now means that the island's accessible by car. It also means that within a matter of months of the opening of the Causeway, you've got the opening of Crandon Park, which becomes, I think, arguably the greatest waterfront park in the state of Florida. And we've talked about the Causeway, its construction. We all know about the fabled second bridge, which was a drawbridge. Anybody who grew up in the 50s and 60s know how difficult it was to get home on a Sunday because the bridge seemingly was always in the upright position. And automobile radiators then were very vulnerable. They would bubble over as you're waiting. So ultimately in 1985, the William Powell Bridge, named for a County Department of Public Works official, replaced what had been the second bridge. But fear not, there was a great fishing area, a catwalk on the other side of the bridge, and that was still very, very busy, and I still see people fishing off of there, including one of my maniacal sons. So I just wanted to take you through here this grand new day, and part of the grand new day was the opening of Crandon Park. And one of the things that any kid growing up in the Miami in the 50s and 60s will tell you, of course, is, and even later, would be the train that took you through here. And I was one of the lucky people. And it's interesting to note that they had an authentic railroad station there. And this railroad station came from Princeton, Florida, a little farming town way down off of US 1, 250th Street, 260th Street. And it was a company town. A man named Gaston Drake, who was a Princeton graduate, named the town for his alma mater. And he painted everything, the alma mater's colors, which were orange and black. And he even painted the train station. Now, the train that ran through here was Henry Flagler's Florida East Coast Railway. Well, very long story short, the railroad stopped going to Deep South Dade by the early 1960s, and this station was very much in place by that time in Crandon Park. So you've got an authentic train station that made everything even more believable when you came there. In fact, here's a railroad tie from the Crandon Park Zoo train. This is really fascinating. And again, you see the coconut palms all around. Many remnants of what had been that coconut plantation. And then one of the big talked about things would be the grand opening of the Canal Park Carousel. Look at this here. Everybody talked about the carousel. I went through it. My children went through it. I've been to so many parties that my children's friends have put on, and this was one of the centerpieces of the celebration. You can see it right here. So you had so many attractions here. We should note that there was a Decade of Progress bond issue that was floated in 1972 in November, and the voters by a 60% a majority voted for, I think it was, just trying to think of what the figure was on bonds. It was millions and millions and millions of dollars, including money for the construction of a new zoo. As a result of that, in 1981, what had been the Crandon Park Zoo since 1949, then moved down to what had been the Richmond Naval Air Station base in Deep South Dade. And what is today's Zoo Miami would open up there. And so the zoo closed down. Today it's Crandon Gardens. But that was also a great focal point, to go to the zoo, to see those animals at that point. I can remember going over as a kid, and even when I was older going over there. It was always a thrill. I'm looking here at the Crandon Park Carousel horse. And of course the question arises right away, was I ever on this thing? Who knows? My children, probably not. But this is a spare for the Crandon Park Carousel. And there's an organization, of course, that has preserved this over time. The carousel was built at the time the park was opened, 1949, and became a centerpiece then, I think, for that playground. And the playground was something that really attracted a lot of kids. So you had so much going on in the park. You had the cabanas that opened up in the early 1950s. You, of course, had the water. You might wonder about the sandbar. See, there's really no wave action there. And what happened was, over time, Mother Nature just kind of dragged a huge, it's like a version of a barrier island. It dragged it running parallel to the shoreline of Crandon Park, and that blocked the flow of water moving at, a pretty brisk pace onto the shoreline. And thus, it's so different from Miami Beach, because Miami Beach didn't have that same phenomenon that Crandon Park had.
Dr. George, that was absolutely wonderful. Thank you. found out more than I didn't know, so that was wonderful. And we appreciate you coming and giving us this lecture, and we look forward maybe to doing it again.
I'd love to, Ann. I'm delighted to be here. Really, it's a wonderful little museum you have, too.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you for having me, too. Thanks
you.
a million.
Have a nice
Thank
day.
you. You too. Thank you. Jane, thank you so much.
Hi, my name is Jane, and again, I want to thank Dr. Paul George for filming our little pop-up museum that we worked very hard on, and we're very disappointed that we could not open because of COVID. The museum is located at 88 West McIntyre, Suite 200 on the second floor. There's more information at our website, Key Biscayne Historical and Heritage Society.
But the key in this museum is only possible through your interest and your donations. So I hope very much that you will help us out. It will be greatly appreciated, so we can continue with the endeavor to bring history to the island.